Sometimes the person you lean on without knowing is the one who ends up holding your entire future together. The train hummed steadily through the cold New York night, its metal body slicing through darkness as city lights flickered past the windows like fading memories. Inside the quiet first-class carriage, the air was warm, soft, almost too calm for the kind of life Sophie Bennett was living. Her head drooped forward, her fingers still loosely gripping the worn strap of her canvas bag. Her eyes burned from exhaustion. 14 hours on her feet at a diner, followed by another shift cleaning offices downtown, and still not enough to cover rent. Not enough to stop the eviction notice folded in her pocket. She had told herself she would just sit for a minute, just 1 minute to rest her eyes. But her body had already made the decision for her. The moment the train started moving, her world blurred, and then gently, quietly, she fell asleep, her head tipping to the side until it landed against something solid, warm, steady. Not a window, not cold glass, but a shoulder, a man's shoulder, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark coat. He didn't move, not at first. Daniel Whitmore had been reviewing documents on his tablet, numbers, projections, decisions worth millions. But the moment her weight settled against him, everything paused. His eyes shifted slowly toward her, taking in the details, the faint smudge of dirt on her sleeve, the slight tremble in her fingers even in sleep, the way her breathing was uneven, like someone who hadn't truly rested in days, maybe weeks. He could have pulled away, anyone else would have, but he didn't. Instead, he let the tablet dim in his hand, his attention now fully on the stranger who had unknowingly crossed into his world. Outside, the train sped past rows of dim-lit buildings, but inside, time seemed to slow. Sophie's head slipped slightly, and he instinctively adjusted, just enough so she wouldn't wake, just enough so she'd be more comfortable. His jaw tightened for a moment, not from discomfort, but from something unfamiliar, something quiet and unsettling. It had been a long time since anyone had leaned on him without expectation, without knowing who he was. The conductor's footsteps echoed faintly from the next carriage, and somewhere down the aisle, a voice murmured about checking tickets. Daniel glanced, once toward the sound, then back at her, his voice low, almost to himself. You really must be exhausted. He shifted slightly again, careful, deliberate, ensuring her rest wouldn't be disturbed. The faint scent of coffee and city air clung to her clothes, and despite everything, there was something disarmingly real about her presence, something that didn't belong in the controlled, polished world he was used to. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. It didn't matter, because for the first time that night, Daniel wasn't thinking about deals or deadlines. He was thinking about the quiet weight of a stranger trusting him without even knowing it. And he didn't move, not when the train slowed, not when the lights flickered softly overhead, not even when the conductor finally stepped into their row. Pausing as he noticed the scene, Daniel lifted a hand slightly, a silent signal, and without a word, the conductor nodded and moved on, leaving them undisturbed. And there, in the soft rhythm of steel against track, a tired girl slept peacefully on the shoulder of a man who could change her life with a single decision, and hadn't yet decided if he would. The train began to slow, the steady rhythm of steel against steel softening into a low, dragging hum as it approached the next station, and Sophie stirred slightly, her brow tightening as if reality was trying to pull her back too soon. Her fingers twitched against the strap of her bag, and her head shifted just enough for her to feel it. Warmth, unfamiliar, solid. Her eyes fluttered open halfway, disoriented, the dim cabin lights blurring into soft halos before her vision cleared, and she realized she was leaning on someone. Her entire body tensed instantly as she pulled back, her heart jumping into her throat. "Oh my God, I am so sorry," she whispered quickly, her voice rough from exhaustion, her hand instinctively brushing her hair back, as if that could erase what had just happened. Daniel turned his head slightly toward her, calm, composed, as if nothing unusual had occurred. "It is all right," he said quietly, his tone even, almost gentle. "You looked like you needed the rest." Sophie blinked, caught off guard by the lack of irritation. Most people would have reacted differently, annoyed, uncomfortable, maybe even rude. But he did not, and somehow that made her more embarrassed. She glanced down at her worn sneakers, then at the edge of his coat, noticing the clean lines, the quality, the quiet detail that spoke of a world far from hers. "I did not mean to fall asleep," she added, softer this time. As if explaining could fix it, Daniel gave a faint nod, his gaze steady but not intrusive. "Long day?" he asked, not out of obligation, but curiosity. Sophie hesitated, just for a second, as if deciding whether to tell the truth or offer something easier. "Something like that," she replied, her lips forming a small, tired smile that did not quite reach her eyes. The train came to a full stop, the doors hissing open as a rush of cold air slipped briefly into the cabin. Somewhere further down, passengers began gathering their things, footsteps, quiet conversations, movement returning to a space that had felt suspended. Sophie adjusted her bag quickly, instinctively creating distance. "Thank you for not waking me," she said, her voice barely above a murmur, and for a brief moment, her eyes met his. There was sincerity there, simple, unpolished, but real. Daniel held that look for a fraction longer than expected, then inclined his head slightly. "You are welcome," he replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A uniformed conductor approached, his posture straightening subtly as he recognized Daniel. "Sir," the man began, but Daniel lifted a hand just enough to stop him. A quiet authority in the gesture that needed no explanation. The conductor immediately nodded, lowering his voice. "We will be arriving at your stop shortly." Sophie noticed the exchange, the shift in tone, the respect, but she did not fully understand it. Not yet. She only felt that something about him did not match the simplicity of the moment they had just shared. The train jolted gently as it began moving again, and Daniel reached beside him, picking up something Sophie had not even realized she had dropped. A small, creased ticket, its edges worn. He held it out to her. "You might need this," he said. Sophie's eyes widened slightly as she took it, her fingers brushing his for the briefest second. "Thank you," she said again, more quietly this time, clutching the ticket as if it mattered more than just a piece of paper. Outside, the city lights grew brighter as they neared the heart of downtown, and inside, Sophie sat a little straighter now, awake, aware, yet something about the stillness that had existed moments ago lingered between them, unspoken, fragile, and as the train carried them forward, neither of them knew that this small, quiet encounter was already beginning to rewrite everything that would come next. The train finally eased into the main station, brakes sighing as it came to a complete stop, and the doors slid open with a soft mechanical sound that released a wave of city noise into the quiet cabin. Sophie stood quickly this time, gripping her bag a little tighter as reality returned in full force. The warmth, the stillness, the strange sense of calm she had felt moments ago was already slipping away, replaced by the familiar pressure of what was waiting for her outside: deadlines, rejection, uncertainty. She glanced once toward Daniel, as if considering saying something more, but words felt too small, too unnecessary for something she did not even fully understand herself. So instead she offered a small nod and stepped out onto the platform. The cold air hit her immediately, sharp and real. People rushed past her in every direction, coats brushing, voices overlapping, footsteps echoing across the concrete. And within seconds, she was just another face in the crowd, blending back into a world that did not slow down for anyone. Behind her, Daniel remained seated for a moment longer, watching through the window as she disappeared into the moving sea of strangers, his expression unreadable, but his eyes followed her longer than expected. Then finally he stood, adjusting his coat with quiet precision before stepping off onto the same platform, his presence instantly shifting the space around him. A man in a tailored suit approached from the far end, walking with purpose. "Mr. Whitmore," he said respectfully, keeping his voice low despite the noise around them. "The car is ready." Daniel gave a slight nod, his gaze briefly scanning the crowd once more, but Sophie was already gone, swallowed by the city. "Cancel the rest of tonight's meetings," Daniel said without looking away for a second longer than necessary. The assistant hesitated, surprised. "Sir, you have a board call in less than an hour." Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly, not in frustration, but in decision. "Reschedule it," he replied calmly, and that was enough. No argument followed, because when Daniel Whitmore made a decision, it was final. They moved toward the private exit where a black car waited, engine running, doors already opened, but as Daniel stepped inside, something stayed with him. Not a conversation, not a name, just the image of a girl too tired to stay awake, trusting a stranger without meaning to. Across the station, Sophie walked quickly toward the street, her shoes scraping lightly against the pavement as she pulled her coat closer around her. She reached into her pocket and felt the crumpled ticket still there, her fingers tightening around it as if it held more weight now than before. She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. "Get it together," she murmured to herself, forcing her steps forward. There was no time to think about what had just happened, no time to wonder why a stranger had been so kind without expecting anything in return, because in her world, kindness usually came with a cost, and she could not afford any more surprises, not now, not when. Everything was already so close to falling apart. A bus roared past her, splashing water along the curb, and she barely noticed, her mind already shifting to the next task, the next chance, the next door she would try to open, unaware that somewhere behind her, in a quiet car moving through the city, a man who had everything was still thinking about the moment a stranger had fallen asleep on his shoulder. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he was not ready to let that moment end. Morning came too fast, and for Sophie it did not feel like a new beginning. It felt like a countdown, the kind that ticked quietly in the background of every thought, reminding her that she was running out of options. She stood outside a tall glass building in downtown Manhattan, its surface reflecting a pale gray sky, the kind of place where everything looked expensive, controlled, and completely out of reach. She glanced down at her reflection in the glass, her coat slightly wrinkled, her shoes worn at the edges, her hair pulled back in a way that tried to look neat, but could not hide the exhaustion underneath. She took a slow breath. Just one chance, she whispered to herself, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. Inside was a folded resume, printed at a public library the night before, slightly smudged but still legible, still hopeful. She stepped inside. The warmth hit her first, followed by the quiet hum of a polished lobby, marble floors, soft lighting, and people who moved like they belonged there, confident, composed, purposeful. Sophie approached the reception desk, her voice steady but soft. "I am here for the interview." The receptionist offered a polite smile, typing quickly. "Name, Sophie Bennett," she replied, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of keys tapping, then a nod. "Please have a seat. They will call you shortly." Sophie turned and sat down, her hands resting on her lap, trying not to fidget, trying not to think about the fact that she had almost not made it here, that she had considered giving up more than once. Minutes passed slowly, each second stretching longer than the last, until a door opened and a man in a suit stepped out. "Miss Bennett?" he called. She stood immediately, following him down a hallway that felt too quiet, too important. They stopped in front of a large conference room. "They will see you now," he said, gesturing toward the door. Sophie nodded, her heart beginning to pound as she reached for the handle. She pushed it open and stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room quickly. A long table, large windows, city skyline stretching beyond. And then the door at the far end opened again. Footsteps, calm, measured, familiar. Sophie turned, and the moment she saw him, everything inside her stilled. Daniel Whitmore walked in as if the room belonged to him. Because it did, his presence filling the space without effort, the same composed expression, the same quiet authority. But now there was no train, no dim lights, no anonymity, just clarity, unmistakable and undeniable. Sophie's breath caught, her mind racing to connect the two moments. The stranger on the train and the man standing before her now, they were the same. And suddenly, the memory of the conductor's tone, the assistant's voice, the way everything had shifted around him, it all made sense. Daniel stopped at the head of the table, his eyes meeting hers, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them, recognition, surprise, something deeper, but just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by professionalism. "Miss Bennett," he said evenly, as if this were their first meeting, as if nothing had happened the night before. Sophie stood frozen for a fraction too long, then forced herself to move, to sit, to breathe. But inside, everything had changed. Because the man who had quietly let her rest without asking anything in return was not just a stranger. He was the one person who now had the power to decide what happened next in her life. Sophie could feel her pulse in her fingertips as she sat across from him. Every instinct telling her this was no longer just an interview. This was something else entirely, something she did not understand and definitely did not control. She placed her resume carefully on the table, trying to steady her breathing, trying to remind herself why she was here, not because of him, not because of last night, but because she needed this, because she had no backup plan left. Daniel took a seat at the head of the table, glancing briefly at the document before looking back at her, his expression unreadable, composed. "You made it here on time," he said, his voice calm, neutral, but the words carried a subtle weight. Sophie hesitated, unsure if he was referring to the interview or something else. "Yes," she replied, her voice quieter than she intended. Daniel leaned back slightly, studying her, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt deliberate, as if he was trying to understand more than what was written on the paper in front of him. "Tell me about your experience," he continued, shifting into the expected rhythm of an interview. But there was something different in his tone, less formal, more attentive. Sophie nodded, forcing herself to focus. "I have been working 2 jobs for the past year," she began, her hands clasped together in her lap to keep them from shaking. "Mostly service work, but I learn quickly, and I do not miss shifts. I do what needs to be done." Her words were simple, direct, not polished, but honest. Daniel listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, not once drifting to his phone or the window behind her, and that alone made her feel seen in a way she was not used to. "Why this company?" he asked after a moment. Sophie swallowed, the question hanging heavier than it should have. She could give the expected answer, something about growth or opportunity, but instead, she told the truth. "Because I need a chance," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his for just a second before dropping again. The room fell silent, not uncomfortable, but still, as if something important had just been placed between them. Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table, thoughtful, measured. Then he leaned forward slightly. "Last night," he said, and just like that, the professional distance shifted. Sophie's breath caught, her shoulders tensing. Instinctively, "You did not ask for anything," he continued, his voice lower now, more personal. "You did not even look at me like I could give you something." Sophie frowned slightly, confused, unsure where this was going. "I did not know who you were," she admitted, almost defensively. Daniel's expression softened just a fraction. "Exactly," he said, and for the first time, there was a hint of something warmer in his voice, something human beneath the control. "Most people do," he added. Quietly, Sophie felt something shift inside her, not fear, not relief, something in between, something she could not quite name. She straightened slightly, her voice finding a bit more strength. "If this is about last night, I am sorry, I should not have." Daniel shook his head once, cutting her off gently. "No," he said, firm but not harsh. "That is not what this is about." He paused, letting the words settle, his gaze steady on hers. "This is about what you did not do." Sophie blinked, caught off guard again, and for a moment, she forgot about the interview, the building, the pressure, everything except the man sitting across from her, and the quiet realization that whatever was happening in this room was no longer following any script she had prepared for. And somewhere deep down, that terrified her just as much as it gave her a reason to hope. Sophie felt the weight of his words settle slowly, like something she could not immediately push away or explain. Her fingers tightened slightly against her lap as she searched for the right response. But nothing felt right, nothing felt safe. "I do not understand," she admitted quietly, her voice steady but uncertain. Daniel watched her for a moment, as if measuring not her answer, but her honesty. Then he leaned back slightly, his tone calm, deliberate. "Most people, when they think they are sitting next to someone with money or influence, they change," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "They ask questions, they calculate, they look for an advantage." Sophie swallowed, her mind flashing back to the train, the silence, the way she had simply fallen asleep without thinking, without planning, without even realizing who he was. "You did none of that," he continued, and there was no judgment in his voice, only observation. "You trusted the moment, not the person." Sophie exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction. I was just tired, she said, almost apologetically, as if minimizing it could make the situation simpler. Daniel shook his head slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of his lips. That is what makes it real, he replied, and for a brief second, the room felt less like an interview and more like something else entirely, something quieter, something more personal. Sophie looked down at the table, her thoughts moving quickly now, trying to find solid ground. Again, if you are offering me this job because of what happened last night, I cannot accept that, she said suddenly, her voice firmer now, surprising even herself. Daniel's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened. I am not asking for sympathy, she added, lifting her eyes to meet his. I need a job, not a favor. The words hung in the air, clear, unfiltered, and for a moment, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Daniel studied her again, longer this time, as if something had just confirmed what he had been looking for. Good, he said simply, and that single word carried more weight than any long explanation could have. Sophie blinked, caught off guard. Good, she repeated, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table, his voice steady, confident. Because I do not hire people I feel sorry for, he said. I hire people I trust. Sophie's breath caught, the shift in the conversation subtle but undeniable. And trust, he continued, is not built in meetings like this. It is revealed in moments when people do not know they are being seen. Sophie felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, not pressure, something deeper, something that made her realize this was no longer about qualifications or resumes. Last night, Daniel said again, softer now. You showed me something most people spend years trying to fake. Sophie did not respond immediately, because she did not know how to respond to that. Her mind racing between doubt and disbelief, between the instinct to step back and the fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, this moment could mean something more than just another closed door. Daniel reached toward the table, sliding her resume back toward her instead of keeping it, a quiet gesture that broke the last piece of formality between them. This, he said, tapping lightly against the paper, tells me where you have been. His gaze lifted to meet hers again, steady, certain, but it does not tell me who you are. Sophie stared at the document for a second, then back at him, her voice softer now, almost cautious. And what do you think I am? She asked, and for the first time since she walked into the room, she was not asking for approval, she was asking for truth. Daniel held her gaze without hesitation, his answer coming without delay. Someone who does not break when life gets difficult, he said. Someone who keeps moving, even when there is no guarantee it will matter. Sophie felt her throat tighten slightly, the words hitting closer than she expected, because they were not guesses, they were accurate, uncomfortably so. And in that moment, she realized something she had not allowed herself to consider before, that maybe the man sitting across from her was not just offering an opportunity. He was seeing her in a way no one else had. Sophie sat very still after his words, not because she was calm, but because everything inside her was moving too fast to show on the surface. Her thoughts pulled in opposite directions, one part of her wanting to believe him, to step into whatever opportunity this was becoming, and another part holding back, cautious, almost defensive, because nothing in her life had ever come without a cost, and this felt too easy, too unexpected. You do not know me, she said finally, her voice quieter now, but steady, her eyes fixed on him with a kind of guarded honesty. Daniel did not look away, did not interrupt, he simply listened, which somehow made it harder for her to continue. You saw one moment, she added, her fingers curling slightly against the edge of the chair. That does not tell you everything. There was no accusation in her tone, only truth, the kind she had learned to rely on when everything else was uncertain. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging her point without resistance. You are right, he said, his voice calm, measured. One moment does not define a person. Sophie felt a small shift of relief, as if the tension between them had softened just enough to breathe again. But then he continued, but it reveals something most people try very hard to hide. Her brows pulled together slightly, confusion. Returning, Daniel stood slowly from his seat, not abruptly, not to intimidate, but with a quiet sense of purpose, he walked toward the large window behind him, looking out over the city for a brief second before turning back to her. People prepare for interviews, he said, his tone thoughtful now, less formal, more reflective. They choose the right words, the right expressions, the right version of themselves. Sophie followed his movement with her eyes, unsure where he was going with this. But exhaustion, he added, removes all of that. He paused, letting the idea settle before continuing. It shows who someone is when they do not have the energy to pretend. Sophie felt that land deeper than she expected, because she knew he was right. There had been no pretending on that train, no effort to impress, no awareness at all. Just pure, unfiltered reality. Daniel stepped back toward the table, resting one hand lightly against its edge. And what I saw, he said, his voice steady, was someone who did not try to take advantage of a situation, even by accident. Sophie let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering slightly. But the hesitation was still there, lingering. Or maybe, she said carefully, I just did not know there was anything to take. Daniel's gaze sharpened slightly, not in challenge, but in recognition. Exactly, he replied. And that is the point. The room fell quiet again. But this time it felt different. Less like pressure and more like space. Space. For something to grow, something neither of them had fully defined yet. Sophie looked down at her hands, then back up at him, her voice softer now, but clearer. If I say yes, she said, choosing her words carefully. I need to know this is real, not just something that fades once the moment is over. Daniel did not hesitate, did not look away. I do not make decisions based on moments, he said firmly. I make them based on what those moments reveal. Sophie held his gaze, searching for any sign of doubt, any hesitation, but there was none, only certainty, quiet and unwavering. And that was what made it difficult, because certainty was something she had never been able to rely on before. She leaned back slightly, taking a breath she did not realize she had been holding. And for the first time since she walked into the building, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that this was not a risk she needed to avoid, but one she might need to take, even if she did not fully understand where it would lead, even if part of her was still waiting for something to go wrong, because deep down, she knew that staying where she was would not change anything. But this, whatever this was, already had. Sophie did not answer right away, not because she did not have an answer, but because for the first time in a long time, her answer actually mattered. She looked down briefly, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table before she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small, creased train ticket, the same one he had handed back to her. She held it between her fingers for a second, studying it like it carried more meaning than it should. Then she placed it gently on the table. Between them, last night, she said slowly, her voice steady but thoughtful. This was the only thing I had that felt certain. Daniel's eyes dropped to the ticket, recognizing it immediately. But he said nothing, giving her the space to continue. I did not know where I was going after that ride. She admitted, her honesty quiet but unguarded now. I just knew I had to keep moving. She lifted her eyes to meet his again. And I still feel that way. Daniel stepped closer, not invading her space, but closing the distance just enough to show he was fully present. Then keep moving, he said simply, his tone calm but firm. Just do not assume the direction will always look the same. Sophie let out a soft breath, almost a quiet laugh, not out of humor, but out of disbelief at how different this conversation had become from anything she expected. She glanced around the room, the polished table, the city skyline beyond the glass, the quiet certainty in everything around her, and then back at him. And where does this direction lead? She asked, not challenging, just asking for clarity. Daniel did not hesitate. That depends on you, he replied. I can open a door, but I cannot decide if you walk through it. Sophie looked at the ticket again, then slowly pushed it across the table toward him, not as a rejection, but as a shift, a silent acknowledgement that she was no longer holding on to the past moment the same way. Daniel glanced at it, then back at her, understanding the gesture without needing it explained. If I take this, he said quietly, there is no going back to that version of last night. Sophie nodded, her expression calm now, more certain than before. I do not want to go back, she said, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her voice, No fear hiding behind her words. Just truth. Daniel picked up the ticket, folding it once before placing it inside his coat pocket. A simple action, but one that carried the weight of a decision being made. He then reached for a folder on the table, sliding it toward her. "This is not a favor," he said, his voice steady. "It is an opportunity." Sophie placed her hand on the folder, but did not open it yet, her eyes still on him, searching for anything that felt uncertain, but finding none. "And what happens if I fail?" she asked, not out of doubt, but out of realism. Daniel's expression did not change, but there was something stronger in his tone now, something grounded. "Then you learn," he said, "and you try again." Sophie held his gaze for a moment longer, then finally opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents. A position, a real one, not entry level, not temporary, something that required trust, something that offered more than she had ever been given before. Her breath caught slightly, not because it was overwhelming, but because it was real, and that made it harder to dismiss. She closed the folder slowly, her fingers resting on top of it as she looked back at him. "I am not saying yes because of what happened last night," she said, her voice clear, grounded. "I am saying yes because I am ready for something different." Daniel gave a small nod, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging what he already seemed to know. And in that moment, the space between them shifted again, no longer defined by coincidence or chance, but by a decision that would change both of their lives in ways neither of them fully understood yet. The city looked different from the 32nd floor, quieter somehow, as if all the noise and chaos had been pushed far below, reduced to distant movement and faint echoes. Sophie stood near the window, the folder still in her hands, her reflection blending with the skyline behind her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to just stand there, to feel the shift that had already begun, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. Daniel remained a few steps behind, giving her space without needing to say it, his presence steady, not pressing, just there. "It feels different up here," Sophie said softly, more to herself than to him, her eyes tracing the lines of the city she had been running through for so long. Daniel followed her gaze, his voice calm. "It is the same city," he replied, "just a different perspective." Sophie let out a small breath, almost a quiet acknowledgement of that truth, because nothing outside had changed. The same streets, the same buildings, the same problems, waiting for her, but something inside her had, and that made everything else feel different. She turned slightly, looking back at him, her expression thoughtful, no longer guarded in the same way. "Last night," she said, "I thought I was just trying to get through another day." She paused, her fingers tightening lightly around the folder. "I did not think it would lead me here." Daniel met her gaze, steady as always. "Most things that matter do not look important in the moment," he said, and there was no need to explain further, because she understood now. She looked down briefly, then back up, a small, genuine smile forming for the first time, not forced, not uncertain, just real. "I almost missed the train," she admitted, a hint of disbelief still in her voice. Daniel's expression softened just slightly. "And I almost left early," he replied, and for a brief second, the weight of coincidence hung between them, not as luck, but as something that felt almost intentional, even if neither of them would say it out loud. Sophie took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to feel less like a guest and more like someone who belonged in the room, even if she was still getting used to that idea. "So what happens now?" she asked, not with hesitation, but with curiosity. Daniel moved to the table, picking up a pen and placing it beside the folder. "Now," he said. "You start." Sophie looked at the pen, then at him, understanding that this was more than just paperwork. It was a line between who she had been and who she was choosing to become. She reached out, her hand steady this time, and picked it up, signing her name slowly, deliberately, each letter feeling like a step forward. When she finished, she set the pen down and exhaled, not out of relief, but out of something stronger, something closer to certainty. Daniel took the folder, closing it with a quiet finality. But instead of putting it away immediately, he paused, his eyes on her. "You did not fall asleep on a CEO last night," he said, his voice calm, but carrying meaning that reached deeper than the words themselves. Sophie looked at him, a slight confusion flickering for just a second, and then understanding followed. You trusted a stranger, he continued, and that is something most people forget how to do. Sophie held his gaze, the weight of that truth settling in, because it was not about the train, or the job, or even the opportunity anymore. It was about that moment, that simple, unguarded trust that had changed everything. She nodded slowly, her voice quiet but certain. Then I guess I chose the right one. Daniel did not answer right away, but the faintest hint of a smile appeared, subtle, almost imperceptible, and for the first time, the distance between their worlds did not feel impossible. It felt like something that could be crossed, step by step, choice by choice. Beginning with one quiet moment on a moving train that neither of them would ever see the same way again.